The mahogany panel chambers of Judge Thomas Ryer of expensive cigars and corruption. Outside Ouagadougou's morning heat was already climbing. But inside this air-conditioned fortress, 3 men plotted in whispers. Thomas adjusted his gold-rimmed eye. Glasses, his pale fingers drumming against files marked confidential. The French corporate lawyer Dubois slid a thick envelope across the polished desk. "The mining contracts must be protected at all costs," he hissed. Thomas nodded, his eyes cold as winter steel. "Traore thinks he can just waltz in here and challenge decades of established law." Thomas sneered, his American accent cutting through. The tension. The third man, a local politician named Sankara, shifted nervously in his leather chair. "Judge, the people love him, if we push too hard." Thomas slammed his gavel down, making both men jump. "The people don't understand international law, Sankara. They don't understand consequences." His voice dropped to a whisper. "But they will." The courtroom beyond these chambers was already filling with reporters, diplomats, and curious citizens. Thomas could hear the murmur of voices, the scraping of chairs, the nervous energy of a crowd sensing history in the making. He straightened. His black robes, checking his reflection in the window that overlooked the bustling streets below. Market vendors were setting up their colorful displays. Children were running to school. Life was continuing as normal. But Thomas knew that in 2 hours, everything would change. Dubois stood up, briefcase in hand, his expensive suit wrinkled from the humid despite the air conditioning. "The fine is calculated to bankrupt any resistance movement," he said with satisfaction. Thomas smiled, a predator's grin that never reached his eyes. $500 million? Even a revolutionary can't survive that? He walked to his desk, picked up the prepared judgment, and felt its weight. Today he would crush the spirit of a man who dared to challenge the old order. The courthouse steps were packed with supporters waving Burkina Faso flags, their red, green, and yellow colors brilliant against the morning sun. Ibrahim Traoré stepped out of his simple government vehicle, refusing the bulletproof car his security team had suggested. His military fatigues were pressed but modest, a stark contrast to the expensive suits of the international lawyers gathering. Inside, children from nearby schools had skipped classes to catch a glimpse of their president, their young voices chanting his name. Ibrahim paused, placing his hand over his heart as he looked up at the imposing colonial-era building. "Today, we face the ghosts of our past," he murmured to his aide. Inside the marble hallway, whispers followed Ibrahim like shadows as he walked toward the courtroom. European diplomats huddled in corners, their faces tense with anticipation of what they hoped would be his downfall. Local journalists pushed forward with their cameras, capturing every step of this historic moment. Ibrahim's security detail moved like a protective wall around him, but his eyes remained calm and focused. He stopped before the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, feeling the weight of his ancestors' struggles on his shoulders. "Whatever happens in there," he told his legal team, "we speak only truth." The courtroom fell silent as Ibrahim entered, his presence commanding despite his youth. Judge Thomas sat high on his bench like a colonial administrator from decades past, his robes billowing as he shuffled through papers. The gallery was a sea of faces, some hopeful, others fearful, all waiting to witness history unfold. Ibrahim took his seat at the defendant's table, declining to stand when the bailiff announced his entrance. His lawyer, a brilliant Burkinabe woman named Fatou, leaned over to brief him on last-minute developments. But Ibrahim's attention was fixed on Thomas, reading the man's intentions in his cold, calculating stare. Thomas banged his gavel 3 times, the sharp sound echoing off the high ceiling like gunshots. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of imposed justice. Ibrahim straightened in his chair, his hands folded calmly on the table before him. Around him, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, but his breathing remained steady and controlled. He'd faced coups, assassins, and international pressure before. Today would be no different. As Thomas began reading the charges, Ibrahim closed his eyes briefly and said a silent prayer for his people. Judge Thomas cleared his throat dramatically, savoring the moment like a predator about to strike its prey. The courtroom held its collective breath as he lifted the prepared judgment. his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to unleash. "President Traore," he began, his voice dripping with false authority. "This court finds you in violation of international mining agreements signed by previous administrations." The gallery stirred uneasily, sensing the trap that had been carefully laid over months of secret negotiations. Thomas paused, letting the tension build like storm clouds gathering over the savannah. His eyes locked with Ibrahim's, expecting to see fear, but finding only calm determination. "The penalties for breach of these legally binding contracts are severe and non-negotiable," Thomas continued, his American accent grating against the ears of the Burkina Faso citizens present. Several diplomats in the front rows leaned forward, their notebooks ready to record this moment of anticipated victory. The French corporate lawyer Dubois smiled thinly from his seat. Already calculating the profits that would flow back to Paris, Thomas lifted the judgment higher like a weapon about to deliver a fatal blow. "This court hereby orders the immediate payment of punitive damages in the amount of," he paused again, milking the drama, $500 million United States dollars. Gasps echoed through the courtroom like thunder rolling across the African plains. Several supporters in the gallery stood up, in shock, their faces reflecting disbelief and outrage. Ibrahim's legal team exchanged quick glances, their prepared arguments suddenly seeming insignificant against this financial nuclear bomb. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, capturing the moment that was supposed to mark the end of Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Thomas banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to the chaos he had unleashed. But in the midst of all this turmoil, Ibrahim Traoré sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged. The weight of $500 million hung in the air like smoke from a burning village. Thomas leaned back in his chair, satisfaction spreading across his face as he watched the shock ripple through the crowd. "Furthermore," he added, his voice cutting through the noise, "failure to pay within 30 days will result in asset seizure and international sanctions." The trap was complete. The noose tightened around the neck of African independence. But as the judge surveyed his courtroom kingdom, he failed to notice the fire beginning to kindle in Ibrahim's eyes. The young president slowly stood up, and something in his posture made the entire room fall silent once again. Ibrahim rose from his chair like a lion awakening from rest, his movements so deliberate that every eye in the courtroom followed him. The silence was deafening. Even the court stenographer stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. Thomas, expecting panic or pleading, instead found himself staring into the calm, steady gaze of a man who had faced down much worse than corrupt judges. The diplomatic section shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their carefully orchestrated show trial might not go as planned. Ibrahim's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried the power of rolling thunder across the savannah. "Your Honor, may I address this court?" Thomas hesitated, his script suddenly feeling inadequate in his sweaty palms. Protocol demanded. He allowed the defendant to speak, but something in Ibrahim's tone warned him that this was not going to be the desperate plea he had anticipated. "You may proceed," Thomas said reluctantly, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. For the first time, Ibrahim stepped forward, not toward the judge's bench, but toward the gallery filled with his people. His boots clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the hushed courtroom. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to follow him, casting his shadow long and strong across the colonial tiles. $500 million, Ibrahim repeated, his voice now reaching every corner of the room. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces of diplomats, journalists, and citizens alike. For what crime exactly? For daring to put the people of Burkina Faso before the profits of foreign corporations? A murmur rippled through the gallery, supporters beginning to sit up straighter in their seats. Thomas banged his gavel nervously, but Ibrahim continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. For choosing sovereignty over slavery disguised as partnership. The temperature in the room seemed to shift, as if the very air was responding to Ibrahim's presence. Judge Thomas found himself leaning forward despite his attempt to maintain judicial distance, drawn into the gravitational pull of the young president's conviction. The French lawyer Dubois frantically scribbled notes, his confident smirk beginning to fade as he sensed the mood changing around him. Ibrahim placed both hands on the defendant's table and looked directly at Thomas, his eyes blazing with quiet. "Fire, Your Honor. Before you destroy a nation with your judgment, perhaps this court should hear about the real criminals in this room." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of a pen dropping would have echoed like thunder. Ibrahim reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents that made Dubois visibly pale. "Your Honor, I present to this court evidence of systematic looting that has drained Africa's wealth for decades," his voice carried across the courtroom like a battle cry, each word precisely chosen and devastatingly delivered. The diplomatic section erupted in urgent whispers, hands reaching for phones that were quickly silenced by baifs. Thomas gripped his gavel tighter, realizing his carefully controlled courtroom was slipping from his grasp like sand through desperate fingers. Ibrahim opened the folder with theatrical precision, his movements commanding the attention of every person present. These documents detail mining contracts signed in secret, environmental destruction covered up, and profits stolen from the people of Burkina Faso. These are classified materials. Dubois jumped to his feet, his expensive suit now damp with nervous sweat, but Ibrahim continued without acknowledging the interruption, his voice rising with righteous fury that echoed off the colonial walls. "Classified to hide the truth from those who own the gold beneath their feet," he declared, holding up a photograph of devastated mining sites. The gallery began to stir, supporters leaning forward to catch every revelation, their anger building. Like a gathering storm? Thomas banged his gavel frantically, but his authority was evaporating with each passing moment. "Mr. Dubois represents corporations that have extracted over $2 billion. Dollar from our soil while leaving our children to drink poisoned water?" The courtroom exploded in gasps and angry shouts as Ibrahim displayed more evidence: bank statements, secret communications, environmental reports that had been buried for years. "Order. Order," Thomas shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. But the people had heard enough to ignite their fury. Local journalists frantically scribbled notes, realizing they were witnessing the exposure of a conspiracy that reached from the mines of Burkina Faso to the boardrooms of Paris. Diplomats huddled together like conspirators whose plot had been exposed to the light of day. Ibrahim stood tall amidst the chaos, his presence commanding despite the storm swirling around him. These are the real crimes that should be judged in this court. Theft disguised as investment, exploitation wrapped in legal documents. The evidence spread across the defendant's table like proof of a massive crime scene. Let's document another nail in the coffin of colonial exploitation. Thomas realized his $500 million judgment was now looking like extortion rather than justice, his face flushing red with embarrassment and rage. The gallery was on its feet now, supporters chanting Ibrahim's name, while others demanded answers from the squirming diplomatic section. Dubois attempted to gather his papers and retreat, but Ibrahim's voice cut through the noise like a sword. Through silk. "Your Honor, I submit that this court lacks the moral authority to find a people fighting for their freedom." The words hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored, transforming the hunter into the hunted. Ibrahim pulled out another document, this one bearing an official seal that made Judge Thomas's face drain of all color. "Your Honor, perhaps the court should know about your own financial interests in the Curry gold mine," Ibrahim announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The courtroom fell silent again, all eyes turning to Thomas, who suddenly looked like a man watching his world collapse in real time. Dubois frantically gestured for Thomas to stop the proceedings, but it was too late. The truth was spilling out like water from a broken dam. The diplomatic section exchanged panicked glances, realizing their carefully chosen judge was now a liability rather than an asset. Thomas gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white with the strain of trying to maintain composure while his past sins came to light. Bank records show regular payments of $50,000 monthly to Thomas Holdings LLC. Ibrahim continued, his voice steady and relentless as morning rain. The gallery erupted in angry shouts, supporters now understanding the full scope of the corruption they were witnessing. Local journalists scribbled furiously, knowing they were documenting one of the biggest scandals in the country's judicial history. Thomas's law clerk, a young Burkina woman, stared at her boss with disgust and disbelief written across her face. Motion to dismiss based on judicial conflict of interest. Ibrahim's lawyer, Fatou, shouted above the noise. The judge, who had seemed so powerful moments before now, looked like a small man caught in a very large lie. The evidence kept flowing as Ibrahim revealed Thomas's luxury home purchase in Virginia, funded by mining kickbacks over the past 3 years. Photographs of the judge's mansion flashed across phones in the gallery as citizens shared the shocking revelations in real time. Thomas banged his gavel desperately, his authority crumbling like ancient walls under the assault of truth and transparency. "These proceedings are out of order," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the righteous anger of the people. Dubois was already packing his briefcase, preparing to abandon his compromised ally like a sinking ship. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight every bead of sweat on Thomas's guilty face. Several court officers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to follow orders from a judge whose integrity was dissolving before their eyes. Thomas stood up abruptly, his black robes billowing as he pointed an accusatory finger at Ibrahim, desperation replacing his earlier arrogance. "You cannot prove those allegations," he screamed. But the documents spread across the defendant's table told a different story. The gallery was now a sea of angry faces, citizens who had trusted the justice system and found it rotten to the core. Ibrahim remained calm in the center of the storm, his moral authority growing stronger as Thomas's legal authority crumbled. "Your Honor, the only criminal in this courtroom is sitting behind that bench," Ibrahim declared, his words echoing like a final judgment. The first person to stand was an elderly woman in traditional dress. Her weathered hands raised high as she shouted in more liar, thief. Her voice cracked with decades of suppressed anger against corrupt officials who had stolen her children's future. Within seconds, the entire gallery was on its feet. A wave of righteous fury washing over the colonial courtroom like a flood breaking through ancient barriers. Young students, market vendors, teachers, and farmers, all united in their outrage at the corruption they had just witnessed exposed. Thomas banged his gavel frantically, but the sound was lost in the roar of people who had finally seen the truth. The baifs looked helplessly at each other, unsure whether to restore order or join the uprising themselves. Down with corrupt judges. Down with colonial thieves. The chant began in the back rows and spread like wildfire through the crowd. Phones were held high, live streaming the moment to the world as Burkina Faso's people reclaimed their dignity in real time. The diplomatic section huddled together like frightened animals, their carefully laid plans dissolving in the face of popular resistance. Several court officers removed their caps, refusing to enforce the authority of a judge they now knew was bought and paid for. Ibrahim watched the scene with quiet satisfaction, knowing that truth had a power no amount of money could silence. The colonial architecture of the courtroom seemed to shake under the weight of voices that had been suppressed for too long. Old man with tribal scars pushed forward, pointing directly at Thomas with a gnarled finger that had worked the gold mines for 40 years. "You stole the gold from under our feet, and now you want to steal our president too." His words cut through the noise like a prophet's declaration. Market women began yodeling, their traditional calls of celebration mixing with the angry chants, to create a symphony of resistance. The French lawyer Dubois tried to slip toward the exit, but found his path blocked by citizens who recognized him from the documents Ibrahim had displayed. Thomas's law clerk stood up and walked out, her resignation clear in every step as she abandoned her compromised position. The people had found their voice, and it was deafening in its power and unity. The courtroom had transformed from a temple of imposed justice into a forum of popular uprising. The colonial order crumbling under the weight of exposed corruption. Children who had skipped school to witness history were now seeing their parents and grandparents stand up to power in ways they had never imagined possible. Ibrahim remained seated, letting the people's anger wash over the courtroom like cleansing rain after a long drought. Thomas clutched his gavel like a weapon, but realized it was powerless against the moral authority of an awakened population. The morning that had begun with his trap to destroy African independence was now becoming a celebration of African dignity. Outside, the sounds of gathering crowds suggested that word was spreading beyond the courtroom walls.
The revolution
was no longer contained. Judge Thomas stood behind his bench like a cornered animal, his black robes offering no protection from the storm of accountability swirling around him. "I order this court to come to order," he screamed, his voice cracking under the pressure. But his words were swallowed by the righteous anger of the people. The baifs had stopped trying to control the crowd, some openly nodding in agreement with the chants echoing off the colonial walls. Thomas's gavel lay forgotten on his desk, as useless as a broken sword in the hands of a defeated general. Sweat poured down his face as he realized the authority he had wielded for years was evaporating like morning mist under the African sun. His eyes darted frantically around the courtroom, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Security. "Clear this courtroom immediately," Thomas commanded. But even his own court officers had turned their backs on him. The head of security, a burly Burkina man named Usman, crossed his arms and stared at the judge with open contempt. "We serve justice, not thieves," Usman declared, his words carrying the weight of every honest officer who had watched corruption flourish in their courts. The diplomatic section was in full retreat, pushing toward the exits as angry citizens blocked their path with questions and accusations. Thomas's law books, symbols of his learned authority, seemed to mock him from their shelves as the People's Court took precedence over his purchased justice. Even the court reporter had stopped transcribing, her loyalty shifting from the corrupt bench to the righteous gallery. The morning light streaming through the tall windows now illuminated a complete reversal of power. With Thomas isolated on his elevated bench like a prisoner in his own dock. "This is contempt of court," he shouted desperately. But the people responded with laughter, bitter, knowing laughter that spoke of years of injustice finally being exposed. Ibrahim remained seated calmly, watching the colonial order collapse around him like walls built on sand finally meeting the tide. The chants grew louder, more unified, as market women's ulations mixed with students' revolutionary songs. Thomas grabbed his papers frantically, trying to restore some semblance of control, but they scattered like leaves in the wind of change. His throne of judgment had become a platform of shame, elevated only to make his fall more visible to all. The courtroom had become a theater of popular justice, with Thomas now playing the role of the accused rather than the judge. Citizens pressed forward, their faces alive with the fire of people who had finally seen behind the mask of false authority. "Confess your crimes," someone shouted from the back, and the demand was taken up by dozens of voices until it became a thunderous chorus. Thomas looked desperately toward the door where Dubois had fled, realizing he had been abandoned by his co-conspirators like a sacrificial offering to the people's rage. The colonial architecture that had once intimidated citizens now seemed to tower over him accusingly, every stone a witness to his corruption. Ibrahim finally stood up and the crowd fell silent, waiting to hear the words of the man who had exposed the rot at the heart of their justice system. Ibrahim walked slowly toward the judge's bench, each step measured and deliberate like a general, surveying a conquered battlefield. The crowd parted before him with reverent silence, understanding they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. Thomas cowered behind his desk, the elevation that had once made him seem powerful now making him look like a trapped animal on display. "Your Honor," Ibrahim said, his voice dripping with irony that wasn't lost on anyone present. "I believe it's time for you to step down from that bench." The words hung in the air like a royal decree, carrying the weight of popular mandate rather than legal authority. Even the sunlight seemed to shift, casting Thomas in shadow while illuminating Ibrahim's path forward. The gallery erupted in cheers as Ibrahim's challenge echoed through the courtroom like thunder rolling across the savannah. "Come down, face the people," the crowd chanted, their voices unified in a demand that transcended legal procedure and touched something primal about justice and accountability. Thomas gripped the edge of his bench with white knuckles, his expensive education and judicial training useless against the moral authority of an awakened population. Security officers stepped aside, making it clear they would not protect a corrupt judge from the consequences of his actions. Ibrahim reached the base of the judge's platform, and looked up at Thomas with eyes that blazed with the fire of African dignity. "You wanted to find me $500 million, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But you cannot put a price on a people's freedom." The courtroom transformed into a forum of popular democracy as citizens began shouting their own verdicts against the compromised judge. Guilty of theft, guilty of corruption, guilty of betraying justice. The accusations flew like arrows, each one finding its mark in Thomas's crumbling composure. His black robes, once symbols of authority, now seemed like the costume of a failed actor whose performance had been exposed. Ibrahim climbed the first step toward the bench, and Thomas actually recoiled, his chair scraping against the floor in a desperate attempt to maintain distance. The colonial order that had elevated corrupt judges above the people was collapsing. In real time, brick by brick, lie by lie. The morning that had begun with Thomas's trap had become Ibrahim's triumph, a complete reversal that would echo across Africa. Thomas made one final desperate attempt to reassert his authority, standing up and pointing his gavel at Ibrahim like a weapon. "I am still the judge in this court," he screamed, but his words were met with derisive laughter from the gallery. Ibrahim smiled calmly and took another step up, now close enough to see the fear in Thomas's eyes behind his gold-rimmed glasses. "You were never our judge," Ibrahim replied, his voice soft but carrying absolute authority. "You were just their puppet." The crowd roared its approval as the truth settled over the courtroom, like morning light burning away the last shadows of colonial deception. Thomas dropped his gavel, the sound of it hitting the floor, marking the end of his corrupt reign and the beginning of something new. Ibrahim stood at the judge's bench, no longer as a defendant, but as the voice of his people's triumph over corruption. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden light across a courtroom transformed from a temple of colonial justice into a symbol of African sovereignty. Thomas had fled through a back door, abandoning his robes and his fraudulent authority like a thief escaping in the night. The crowd erupted in celebration, their voices rising in traditional songs of victory that had been sung by their ancestors. After great battles, children who had witnessed this historic moment would tell their grandchildren about the day a young president exposed the lies that had bound their nation. The $500 million fine lay forgotten on the floor, as worthless as the corrupt system that had produced it. Citizens poured out of the courtroom and onto the streets, carrying the news of victory to every corner of Ouagadougou like wildfire spreading across dry grass. Market women eluded with joy, their voices echoing off the colonial buildings that had once intimidated them but now seemed diminished in their power. Students raised flags high above their heads, the red, green, and yellow colors brilliant. Against the clear morning sky, diplomatic cars that had arrived with such confidence now slunk away like defeated predators, their occupants making frantic phone calls to report the failure of their carefully laid plans. Ibrahim emerged from the courthouse to find thousands of supporters gathered, their faces alive with the hope of a people who had reclaimed their dignity. The sound of their celebration carried across the city like a new national anthem. Foreign journalists who had come to document Ibrahim's downfall instead found themselves reporting on the collapse of a corrupt judicial conspiracy. Camera crews captured scenes of ordinary citizens dancing in the streets, their joy infectious and their message clear to the world watching. The mining contracts that had seemed so unbreakable that morning were now exposed as fraudulent documents designed to steal a nation's wealth. Ibrahim addressed the crowd from the courthouse steps, his words simple but powerful. "Today we proved that no amount of money can purchase the soul of a free people." His voice carried across the gathering like a prayer, answered like rain after a long drought. The revolution that had begun in a courtroom had spread to the streets and would soon reach every village in Burkina Faso. As the sun climbed higher in the African sky, illuminated a new chapter in the story of a people who had refused to be silenced by corruption and intimidation. The courthouse behind Ibrahim no longer represented colonial domination, but stood as a monument to the power of truth over lies, justice over greed. Children ran through the crowds with homemade flags, their laughter mixing with the voices of their elders in a symphony of liberation. The $500 million trap had become a $5 billion victory. Not in money, but in dignity, sovereignty, and the unbreakable spirit of Africa. Thomas's gavel would rust in some forgotten drawer, but the echo of Ibrahim's words would ring through history. The dawn that had threatened to bring darkness had instead brought the brightest light Burkina Faso had seen in generations. Ibrahim Traoré turned a $500 million trap into Africa's greatest victory against judicial corruption, proving that truth always defeats money and manipulation. What did you think of this incredible courtroom showdown? Subscribe for more stories of African leaders fighting colonial schemes, and share your thoughts in the comments below.